Hello, everyone, and welcome. Here it is, episode 12 of season 2 of the Historians Lounge. I cannot believe it. We are finally here. And if this is your first time watching this episode, my name is Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we are joined by a first timer here on the show. My guest today is a postgraduate student pursuing a Master's of Arts in Mediterranean Archaeology from University Colleges in London, acclaimed Institute of Archaeology. She is passionate about studying medieval and ancient societies, religious and social interactions, particularly regarding women and children, funeral, funerary rituals, constructed space, cultural syncretism, and much more. She earned her BA magna cum laude in history, archaeology, and French from Dickinson College in May of last year, earning departmental awards for excellence for all three majors. And in November of last year, the Swarthmore Undergraduate History Journal published her senior history thesis, Heroes, Victims, and Future Citizens, Representation of French Children During World War I. Her studies have allowed her to work in several other countries and multiple languages, increasing her research depth and allowing her to approach work with a multicultural lens. More recently, she excavated at the Kerdylion site in northern Greece as part of the Argilos Greco-Canadian Archaeological mission through the University of Montreal before joining the Pompeii Porta Sarno Necropolis project in its bioarchaeological excavations in the ancient Roman city of Pompeii. And with all that said, she has a deep passion for preserving the stories and the remains of the past and educating others about our shared cultural heritage. So, without further ado, let us give a huge welcome to today's guest, historian, archaeologist, and all around amazing person, Megan Outtrim. Megan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So before we dive into today's topic, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners?
Nothing I can think of.
All right. So for today's topic, viewers and listeners, this actually is going to be right in Megan's ballpark because we'll be talking about children in the ancient Mediterranean world, which I am very excited to explore. So, as a little icebreaker into this topic, Megan, how have you been able to manage and balance your passions and majors? Because history, archaeology, French. How have you been able to do that? And how just everything from the digs in Greece to Pompeii, just how did that all start?
Well, I've always really loved history and archaeology, always been passionate about it, and I knew I wanted to study them. So I started out as a double major, history and archaeology, and I was minoring in French. And then when I studied abroad in France, I became very passionate about Roman Empire and the history of that because it was just the whole southern part of France is filled with the remains of Roman
Hmm.
towns. And the French department at my college, they kind of convinced me to make my minor another major. So then I ended up with the three. And I just decided I really wanted to continue pursuing ancient history and archaeology. So that's how I ended up at UCL, where I'm about to start my second term. Uh, so fingers crossed, it goes well.
Awesome. So I guess let's just dive right into the topic. So I've always been fascinated about, we always think of like past civilizations, like the societies of themselves, but children have always been another lens of study, which really doesn't get a lot of scholarship. So, Megan, what sort of led you to, among the many other avenues in archaeology, regarding children? What have you learned like thus far about this topic?
So definitely, like you said, it's a very understudied area. Although within the last couple, 2, 3 decades, maybe they've really started picking up a little bit. So we have a bit of a nice published bibliography now we can go off of, which is really nice. But it is still very overlooked, which is strange when you think about it, because what are the two things that all humans share? It's childhood and death. So
Right.
those are things that I really focus on. But I actually started out with childhood accidentally, because my senior seminar for history was about modern children's history, which is why my publication is about children. And I just kind of fell in love with the idea of studying what was childhood in the past, and what is a child biologically versus what it is culturally. So I decided I really wanted to pursue that in archaeology and see where you can sort of discover that in these ancient civilizations, where they're so different, but they also are the core of what our modern civilizations are built off of. It's really interesting to just you can get really kind of a microcosm of society as a whole, because you're seeing an intersection of the multiplicity of identities. You're seeing age, obviously, as a lens. You're also seeing gender. You're also seeing sometimes sexuality, religious ritual. You're seeing how families are showing both emotions like grief over the loss of a child in a child's grave, as well as also using it as an opportunity to show their own social status, like you see with the liberti, the freed slaves of Rome. So you get a lot of really interesting like interactions of these different social levels.
Absolutely. And I think for, for us, generally speaking, when we think of like children in the ancient world, I think the one that's probably been most immortalized by going a little slight off tangent to like media is, of course, the Spartans of Greece, because we have like the most, documentation on that, but also movies and comics like 300 have glorified, what the childhood was like. And I've even done research on the Spartans in my own works, especially for one of my books, Amon, Son of Persia. And for people who have only seen 300, there is truth in the depictions of childhood for specifically the Spartans of southern Greece. But also the history behind that is a lot more. I don't want to say more graphic, because that's a more modern term, but it's a very, if you grew up in Sparta, you pretty much were judged very early on if you were going to live or die. Any imperfections, you were immediately thrown away. And if you didn't die there was a possibility you would have died in training. So I'm curious, in your research looking at, children or sites where families live, especially like in Pompeii, was there any like remains of like, when we also think of childhood, toys, any form of artifacts that would have been what at the time would have been like childhood amusement, like games or toys of some kind, that also show a lens into what life was like back then?
So when I was digging in Pompeii, we actually didn't see anything to do with children, unfortunately.
Mm,
But I know that Pompeii has had, in their millions of excavations over the centuries, they have found in different houses lots of rooms where there have been things that have been interpreted as children's toys, figurines that are possibly dolls, possibly religious in nature, um, other sorts of amusements for kids. But you also see what's interesting is you see things, especially in like grave sites and in these different domestic dwellings, little models of like full size vases and things like that.
hmm
And in Cyprus, you see these really interesting kind of, for lack of a better word, terribly made pots. And Cyprus was
Right.
really well known for its pottery. So I know a lot of people in the past have been like, what caused them to be baking and like wasting these resources by actually baking these terrible pots? And there was a scholar, I forget what her name is, unfortunately, but a couple years ago she did a talk at my school, and she was talking about how, well, these were probably children who were learning the trade at their parents' knee, and they
hmm
were sculpting these things, and the parents would fire them just like we do with like little kids art projects these days, and they'd keep it, and the children would, it would be play, but it would also be a way of technical learning.
Right. And now, kind of branching out into more of the history side, I'm curious, Megan, like in your research, did you also explore like childhood possibly in ancient Egypt and possibly Carthage too? Because I definitely feel when we think like the ancient Mediterranean world, a lot of people go to Rome and Greece, which is very fair because there's a lot more documentation, but those weren't the only other cultural centers of the Mediterranean world. You had Egypt, which has existed far longer, culturally speaking, history speaking, than Greece and Rome, and even Carthage, too, which has its own identity. So, have you been able to explore into those areas as well?
Yeah, so Egypt I've worked with definitely. If you look through some of like Lynn Meskel is a an Egyptologist. She has some interesting writings about social histories and social anthropologies, and she's done some work on children in Deir el Medina, which was a workmen's village in the New Kingdom. It's really interesting site. Um, but you also see it's interesting because whereas there's sort of an idea that in Greece and Rome, children were not as valued, they were not as
Mm.
emotionally attached to them, which is false. We know that.
Right.
Um, there is this idea that persists because of the process of exposure, which is,
Mm.
leaving infants out to die if they're not accepted into the family by the head of the household.
Right.
That doesn't really exist in Egypt. Egypt seems to have been uh, much more, I don't want to say loving to the children because that's not an accurate like phrase, but
Right.
they valued children very highly, and
Hmm.
children seem to have had a pretty not equal status socially, but on a higher level than in Rome and Greece, where children were ultimately under their father's control until they became adults themselves. Um,
Absolutely.
Carthage, I unfortunately don't have much information on, but it is something that I would love to explore more because the Phoenicians were so important. Um, and like you said, the Mediterranean people tend to focus on Greece and Rome, the classical archaeology, because there's that long lingering idea of the Western civilization. It's built on this. It's
Hmm.
them versus us kind of idea when you start looking
Right.
at others. But that's one of the reasons I chose UCL for my program. It's because they have Mediterranean archaeology. It's very pan-Mediterranean versus, for example, Oxford, which has a wonderful program, but it's classical archaeology, which is
Mm.
mainly focused on, the classical civilizations, Greece, Rome. But they all are so important.
Absolutely. And I think also another one to talk about too is like, and maybe you maybe also be researching this on the site, is also the the Levant region, which is now we consider like Judea, Syria, which that is also another avenue to explore. And I also think what's also really important to discuss when it comes to childhood in the Mediterranean world is also when it comes to social class, especially if you look in Rome, where Rome has probably like at its time, probably the most rigid and probably most well structured, social hierarchy of its time when it was like the only empire after it conquered Egypt, of course, in the Mediterranean region, where it comes to not just the children, but also their families from the plebeians, the elites, the slaves underneath, and then also when you look into military families, which I've also found very fascinating, is for those who have been in the army and their families, they actually go to military colonies where almost all the housing is almost like you can compare it to housing for World War II veterans, where they went purchase homes that were mostly occupied by the U.S. government at the time, and their neighbors were, of course, former veterans. But the difference, which I found very fascinating, is in those military colonies, it was already indoctrinated into the children, especially the boys, that they would go into the army. That was the sort of like, I don't want to say the give and take, but that was sort of like the I can't find the right word, but it was the result of going into these military colonies, which that's very, very different from, of course, with World War II veterans and the rise of the nuclear family. So that actually leads to another discussion, Megan. In your research, what was probably the one thing that shocked you and intrigued you about childhood in the Mediterranean world?
Oh, well, it's a good question, because there's certain things that you read and you're like, oh, that takes you back for a minute, but you
Hmm.
logically know it would have existed. So I know one thing that kind of stopped me in my tracks once was reading a paper about the remains of a child that were found in Egypt, and it was a 3-year-old child, I believe, and the child had signs of abuse, and that's something that really just makes you stop, because you know that it exists and that it has always existed, unfortunately, but to see the evidence of it just makes it very real. Um,
Right.
so that's probably one of the big ones that I remember. But I think it's just a lot of times it's seeing how active children are in their like society in ways that we don't really have today. Because ever since the idea of the modern child and modern
Hmm.
childhood was conceptualized in the West, at least, I can't really speak for outside the West.
Hmm.
Um, you've got these ideas of separate spaces for children that are reserved for them: schools, summer camps, uh, all sorts of little play programs and things.
Hmm.
You've got rooms in your house that are reserved for children, not only their own bedrooms, but toy rooms. And uh, you've got all sorts of spaces that are reserved for them. And so that's something we are very accustomed to, but that would not have been at all existent in the past.
Hmm.
They were integrated in every level into just everyday society, but that didn't mean they were viewed as mini adults. They were understood to be a separate thing, separate children. Um, and it's interesting to sort of tease out those complexities.
Yes.
Yeah.
I definitely agree, especially going back, of course, to Rome, which probably has like the most like information, at least for my research, is also when it comes to the family names, when it comes to naming children, which I found very fascinating. Which, for those who don't know, when it comes to naming, Roman children, there's actually a formula. Give an example, viewers and listeners. Probably the most famous, Julius Caesar, which, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, Megan, his actual name was Caesar, but his family was from the house of, for the line of Julia. That was his family house. So it's very fascinating because I always, well, for most people, we think Caesar is the last name. And we look at more modern, naming of children. That's not the case. Caesar is his first name. Julia or Julius is his family's name, which I find equally, so fascinating. Like the whole science, not science, but the whole lore behind these ancient names, these ancient houses. And also, speaking of children, also is adopted children in the ancient Mediterranean world and how they were viewed, especially if you look at, the Roman aristocracy when it came to, of course, Octavian. Octavian was the nephew of Julius Caesar, but he was viewed as his heir and his son. And it's very interesting how you were talking about how they weren't sort of viewed as like mini adults, but they were like a separate entity. But also in that, children in the in the ancient world, even like the medieval, and you can argue still now, at least in places of power, children are used as pawns, or at least aspects of power, which it is a very fascinating topic to explore. And I'm wondering if you ever uncovered that in your research of like, how children and like, it's not like super, super like rulers of like an empire, but still like members of like the aristocracy, how their families were used in like sometimes in political games with other families.
So I haven't studied it in the aristocracy as much as I've studied it sort of in the lower rungs of society, because
Okay.
I think, like, obviously the aristocracy is easy to study because they have so much written about them
Hmm.
and all of that. But I find it really fascinating to tease out. what's happening at the lower rungs, the
Mm,
more like common rungs, because especially with, for example, the freed slaves of Rome, they have almost full Roman citizenship. They are considered Roman citizens once they're freed, but they have like a couple things that they can't do. But their children are free-born Romans, so they are
right.
fully Roman. And a lot of them, a lot of these families become very rich after they have,
Hmm.
uh, been freed. And old money never likes new money. The Roman senatorial class did not like these
Oh,
families.
yes.
So you get a lot, especially in grave sites of children. You get a lot of times these some of the most well preserved examples of elite iconography come from freed slaves because they are trying to preserve. They're not only reproducing elite status to show that they are going to be considered amongst the elite of the Romans
Hmm.
and that they are fully Roman now. But they are also usually for a child who has died prematurely, um, which of course with children is it's always premature.
Hmm.
Um, you have a lot of times like iconography of, for example, boys who are older than they actually were when they died, and they're portrayed maybe as warriors or as wrestlers or as
Hmm.
politicians, and they have whatever small accomplishments those children were able to do in their time, or whatever traits uh, that they seem to have been developing pretty well are written on their epitaphs. So it's things like, oh, he won a competition for oration, or this child was 6 years old, but he already showed a really great adept skill at memorization. And they are doing these things to sort of show, on one level, it's to show socially, this is what our child could have been. This is us in the Roman fold, us as part of this culture. But on another hand, it is a form of closure for the families.
Hmm.
It's a form of grieving and of emotion because you are having these children being shown as what their life could have been if it had been cut short. So it's interesting because it has this multiple layered like nature to it, and you
Hmm.
also get that in ancient Greece to a degree. And I do wonder, like I'd like to research more and see if, because the Greeks influenced the Romans so much. I would love to see if there's evidence of it being like a direct sort of correlation between the ancient Greek memorializations and the ancient Roman ones, because you get some classical Attic uh, iconography of funerary stelae, where it's, for example, there's one of Euphoros who was in the Kyriakos cemetery in
Hmm.
Athens, and he is shown as like a around 15-year-old youth holding a strigil, which was of course used to clean off the sweat
Right.
after wrestling, and it talks about like his wrestling skills, and he was buried with a strigil when they uncovered it, and he would have been actually younger than they portrayed him as. And so it's the same
Mm.
kind of idea of embodying in this like marble or whatever stone they're using, um, sculpture, who this child could have been, and in a way that stone becomes the child itself embodied into it, becomes a
Mm.
sort of like stand-in that you can interact with. So it's interesting.
Definitely. Now I'm gonna make a little tangent to another cultures, going back to also funerary rites, but also can bring it back to here. Now I know in Japan there's also those, I forgot the actual name, but there are these little shrines that families have gone to, which are to honor the passing of children, like the guardians of the spirits of lost children. And I'm wondering, Megan, in your research, have you uncovered something similar in the ancient Mediterranean world, where there's like a temple specifically to families for children, or like children of families, or like some form of deity that's associated with the passing of children?
So there's no deity associated, like where their job is primarily to guide lost children, but there are deities who have been associated with those contexts.
Mm.
So you get some, uh, like there's a whole different variety of who they're praying to and who they're sacrificing to for what. There are a few deities that get pulled out more than others. A lot of times amulets get left in grave sites.
Right.
funerary assemblages that sort of are meant to fulfill the like religious role of how you can bury a child and send them off to the underworld. But what's interesting is you also see degrees of like socially where personhood is considered to start um, in children's graves, because you get a lot of times if you have, for example, a a body that's buried under the house versus in a cemetery. That is a
Right.
child that is died before its time,
Mm.
died very, very young, and it's before they're considered fully a person. Usually before the naming ceremony, like the first, I think it's like 10 days
Ooh,
of
okay.
like Roman context, and so they are not considered a person yet, but they are not a person. So they're not buried
Mhm.
in the cemetery with the rest of the family and with the older children. And there are also cemeteries where younger children are separated from older children because there's different stages of developing into personhood. Um, but they are buried in the house so that they're still like around the living, because they're not among the living, but they're not really among the dead at the same time. So you get
Mm.
things like that, which are really interesting. But
That is actually really fascinating because, yeah, it really does put things into perspective. Like, yes, we do have, cemeteries, which that's another discussion entirely when it comes to the ancient Mediterranean world, but also, of course, some families bury their loved ones, even if not children, like people like aunts, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers in the house, and there's a shrine dedicated to them as almost like a place of, respect, which is very, very fascinating. And I think one that also is very intriguing to me, especially if you were, I hate to make this comparison to nowadays in the modern time, how it's in the US, we're very diverse nation and country. And when you look at the ancient Mediterranean world, especially when you get looking at specifically Egypt and Rome in particular, at their different points, they were no longer, you know, traditional Romans in the sense that they were, born in the Italian peninsula. They were people from, Germany, from Gaul, and from the other German lands who integrated. And then you have this mixing of cultures and of families where you have children who are in some cases German descent but are Roman by identity, and then you have of course children that are native born Romans because their families are Roman by birth. Have you ever come across that in your research and almost like this discussion of intermixing families, or I should say mixed families of the ancient Mediterranean world?
so I haven't run into mixed families too much. You do see, like, especially like in certain contexts in Egypt, I've read about, for example, in Deir el Medina, there's
Hmm.
cases of adopted children who are being raised by different families, and it
Ah.
changes their like status and everything. But there is so much, especially in like Rome, there's so much going on interculturally, because there's a long-standing debate in archaeology about a term called Romanization, which is sort of the idea
Yes.
of the top-down acculturation of
Hmm.
from Rome. All the provinces are trying to become like Rome, but that's been largely rejected, rightfully so. Um,
Hmm.
it is now I like to view it as a form of cultural bricolage, but
Mm.
there and creolization. Uh, there's a term that was coined back in, I think it was 2020, by a couple of authors whose names escape me, but they
Hmm.
wrote about what they called creolage, which is sort of a
Ah.
combination of these two ideas, cultural bricolage and creolization. And it's an idea that they are getting these hybrid cultures in the provinces, uh, but they are also at the individual level making decisions as individual social agents to take maybe an aspect of this culture and an aspect of this native culture and an aspect of Roman culture, and they're building these different structures and different
Hmm.
artifacts that then the next generation chooses whether or not to reproduce them, and that creates hybrid cultures. And sometimes it can bypass Rome completely. Like there's some examples of people who were living in Gaul, and they might have come from the Levant, and they're representing gods from the Levant on a funerary monument, and they're representing it next to a god from Gaul, and they are not referencing Rome at all. And so you get these interesting cultural moments, uh, and that's something that I think would be really fascinating to study, is how children's graves and children's grave goods especially, and even like their participation in ritual, how that varies based on the province, and what remains like brought in from Roman greater culture, and what is more localized phenomena. And so that's something that I think would be really fascinating to study more about.
Definitely. And also going back to this topic of childhood in the ancient Mediterranean world, sorry, it got me thinking of, what truly exactly was the childhood like, or even if there was what we would consider a childhood in, from our modern use of the word to now. And could there have been like a childhood for the children? Like, yes, they did have moments, they did have their adolescent years, but would the years after that be considered a childhood? Because, of course, in these societies, the children are raised very early on that they have a duty not just to their families, but to the state, and they have to uphold that. They either had to get, if you were very wealthy, you had a tutor. If you were like a slave and now had some wealth, you could possibly hire a tutor. And that also came down to languages of like how these children were taught, like to read, to write. They learn a trade. And that actually I pose to you, Megan, in your research, did you have this notion that there may have been a childhood in the Mediterranean world, or could one argue that the word childhood as we use it is vastly different to the sources that you have uncovered?
So sort of in between the two. Like
Okay.
childhood did exist, but it would have been like the term childhood differs greatly depending on the context it's used in.
Mm,
So modern childhood wouldn't have existed. That would not have been a thing because it's very protected, very
right.
we keep our children separate. We keep them in very secure, protected environments. Um, that that wouldn't have been what was happening back then. But you do have a lot of ancient sources, a lot of literary sources, but also like the material archaeological evidence that show children are like considered separate from
Mm,
adults, and there are separate different stages within um, childhood. There's infancy versus like a small child versus an older child and an
right.
adolescent, and there tends to be childhood is longer for adult for sorry not adults for men, for boys in most of these societies, especially Greece and Rome. Um, but uh, for girls, it tends to end when they first get their menstrual cycle, and then they
Mm,
are considered of marriageable age. They're able to become mothers. So, especially for example, in Rome, you're seeing young girls who are between like 12 and maybe like 18 at the older end of the spectrum, more like 16,
mm,
17. They are often getting married for the first time within that range. Sometimes a little bit younger, if especially in the more rural areas of Rome. Um, but men are having their first marriage typically between their mid 20s and their late 20s. So
ah,
they're getting these very vast differences in how childhood is treated depending on gender a lot of the
right.
times as well. And sometimes you're also getting situations where a young girl is having her first marriage to someone who it's a man who's not on his first marriage, it's maybe his second or third. And so you get a case like Cicero, who was mocked for marrying a 16-year-old when he was in his 50s. And the comments he made at the time about it were, well, she'll be a woman in the morning. They were praised by his contemporaries as being like, oh, this is a great response, but we'd view them as pretty crude today.
Definitely. And also, kind of adding on to that, when we look at Pompey marrying Julius Caesar's daughter, and Pompey was vastly older than Julius Caesar. I mean, Julius Caesar, I think, to my knowledge, he was like possibly in his early to mid 20s, and his daughter was still just a little girl at the time. And now when he came back, and the story of his life and his biography, she was like, as you said, probably like maybe 16, possibly 17. And Pompey was definitely like probably around the same age as Cicero. And of course, you know, it's very fascinating. Like, at the time, the contemporaries of that era, and even like a few hundred years after, we're like, oh, like you said, very good, like a very well responded, retort to these comments. But looking at it from the modern lens, that we think, oh, that's crude. And I think that's another thing we also should talk about is like, how we perceive childhood back the ancient world. Because going back to what you said, that, when we think of childhood now, in our day and age in the modern world, it's very protective. We shelter children, we put them in these specific places where they're not yet ready to accept the realities of the world. Whereas if you look in the ancient world, they already knew what was expected of them, regardless of where they were on the social um, hierarchy. And going back to Greece and specifically Sparta, the one thing I've always found very fascinating is the women and the girls of Spartan culture. How, and I could be wrong in this, and the information could be a lot of data, but Spartan women were valued very highly in southern Greece. I mean, these women were trained just as hard as the men. They learned, poetry, they learned reading. They were also very, very athletic to their male counterparts. And the one thing I found very fascinating is, Spartan men are, of course, they are required to look for prospective wives. And sometimes they will force themselves, sometimes assault women in Spartan societies. But I remembered one instance I was reading for research of this one Spartan woman who kicked the living daylights out of her would-be uh, husband. And I absolutely loved that. And then how, like, someone will only ever, to use the term from the author, submit to someone who they considered was, a worthy husband. It's like their character. And I just found that very fascinating, like the childhood differences. Like if we looked at like nowadays, and it's like, oh, that's awful. That's she shouldn't have to do that. But we have to understand, if we were in that time period, that would be expected of us at those times. And I think, we tend to kind of put a lot of criticism on the ancient world when it comes to aspects of like the family, childhood, how they approach topics that we are still experiencing nowadays. And so, with all that said, Megan, I now ask you this question, which I've been thinking of. What has probably been the biggest myth about the ancient world, specifically children in the ancient world, that you were able to find and through research debunk? And why was that such an important moment?
I mean, it sounds kind of basic, but the biggest myth is that they weren't loved. Because children,
Mm,
there's, especially like again with Greece, with Rome, where there's, especially in Rome, the paterfamilias, the head of the household, the
yes.
father, and they can choose to expose their children if for some reason they don't want to accept them, um, and no one can say word one about it. Um, Hypothetically,
Right.
it didn't always play out exactly like that, but there's just this idea that because they had so many children and they knew that those children, a lot of them weren't going to live very long, because I mean we always say the lifespan of the Romans was like 25, but that's a very inaccurate kind of
Yes.
number, because that statistic is coming from the amount of children dying under 10. That is
Right.
skewing the numbers completely. It's about
Mm-hmm.
50% of children don't make it past 10. And so there's this idea that because the child death is so common, that
Mm-hmm.
they don't put in any emotional sort of effort. They don't devote anything to loving their children. They just sort of raise
Mm-hmm.
them. They treat them like property, and that's very, very false. You see some beautiful, especially like you get ideas that like, especially girls, that they are really disliked because everyone wanted a boy. And in some cases, yes, obviously these are patriarchal societies. These
Right.
are very strict. um, but you do see some very touching, usually epitaphs that parents write for their children who have been lost to them. And so you get things like talking about, like fathers talk about their 2-year-old daughters and the things that they miss about her.
Mm,
You get Cicero, who had to confine himself basically to his country house when his daughter died because he was so distraught. And she was an adult woman by that point, but she and him were so close, and he could not handle her death.
mm,
Um, you get a lot of examples of children being depicted in iconography alongside their parents. Um, especially once you get to like early Christian art, you see in the catacombs beautiful depictions from like mothers commissioning for their usually wealthy mothers commissioning portraits of like their daughters and their sons who have passed, and giving them beautiful spots of honor in these catacombs in these Christian
mm.
cemeteries in the early like second century AD.
Right.
It's very touching. Because you're seeing the emotion, you're seeing the grief, and it's so real. It's very visceral, and that's just the biggest myth that I think there is that they didn't care about their children because they were people and they loved their kids.
Absolutely. And I think another society that we haven't really touched on, or I didn't bring up, is of course the emergence of the Byzantines or the Eastern Roman Empire, which emerged after, of course, the major split. And I'm very curious, Megan, have you researched, children in the Eastern Roman Empire, and has there been any differences as opposed to children of, let's say, the Western Mediterranean region?
So Byzantine, I unfortunately have pretty limited experience with. Um, I did take a course in my undergrad that sort of covered all medieval Europe, and it did talk about Byzantine, but that wasn't children focused. But
Mm,
I can imagine I would be interested in for doing some further research to see if this is correct. But I would imagine that it would be sort of an interesting combination of Hellenization and the Roman style treatment of children, which of course were pretty similar in a lot of ways, but there were differences. But because it's in the eastern half of the empire and it's becoming more and more Hellenized the longer it goes, I mean, the language changes to Greek predominantly.
hmm.
Um, so I'd be very interested in seeing how that plays out. But I imagine that it would be very much like how throughout time Greek children were treated. I imagine it would be sort of a continuation of that. But I can't say for certain.
Right. That's a very fair, because I've always been very fascinated by the Byzantines. I think, when we learn about the Eastern Roman Empire and, of course, the Byzantines themselves, they are probably among the many empires that I think they do get a lot of scholarship, but depending on what scholarship within Byzantium studies, it can kind of be, a hit or miss. So that is a very, very true that, possibly it's a mix of, Western Roman teachings and a little bit of Hellenistic culture. But yeah, we don't know for sure, but could possibly well be a blend of the two. And I think also another thing I've always been fascinated when it comes to, childhood is, of course, trinkets, toys, or something that's of some physical representation of childhood. And I think I may mention this earlier, but maybe going into um, Greece, were there any artifacts that you uncovered with the team that had like representation of, like, like a toy horse or something? Because a lot of media that I've seen try to figure out, okay, well, what toys or something would children have had back in the day, and were there ever such a thing as toys? I know there were a lot of trinkets back in the ancient world, but toys is a very more modern thing. Also, you could argue like dolls as well. Was there something similar in that sense to the ancient world?
Yeah, so when I was digging in Greece, I was digging along a fortification wall of a colony. So
Hmm.
most of what I was finding was fill layer, things like nails and lots of
Right.
pottery. But when I've done some reading up on Greek artifacts surround in child contexts, And it is a little bit more difficult because one, children are more ephemeral. They're vastly underrepresented in
Okay.
the archaeological record, because we know that numbers would have been much higher of how many children there were and how many children were dying than what we see in the ground. They are very, very underrepresented because their remains just don't preserve very well. And
Mm,
they're easily destroyed if you go in with a plow, if you go in over the years and you're building, constructing, it just destroys them. And they're usually not buried in very elaborate ways. They're buried under the house, or they're maybe cremated, or they're buried in wooden boxes instead of stone, something like that.
right.
So, but children, and also children's context, can be hard to identify because,
Mm,
they weren't as separate as they would have been today. Like someone trying to find children of the 21st century, a
right.
1,000 years from now, will be able to find, like, this room is filled with children's toys. It is mainly for the child.
Ah,
And like, here are different things they did that we can see their agency more clearly. But in the past, because they're sort of mixed up, it's a little bit harder to determine what's a toy, what's not a toy, what's a votive offering.
mm,
But we do think that there are toys. We do see a lot of rattles, usually in shapes of different animals, which are really cute. There's some really good ones at the British Museum. If you go into, there's a room that's talking about just sort of like comparative aspects of daily life in Greece and Rome. And there's a good little section that's all, it has like a bunch of these little rattles shaped like owls and different creatures. It's got little like toy like little horses and
right.
chariots and things. There's marbles, there's dies, there's dolls, things like that. um, but you don't see as many, like, it's not like today where there's a
Right.
huge economic industry just aimed at
No.
children.
That's actually, this is why I love this series so much, because you learn so many new things. And I definitely think, and you definitely agree, Megan, that I think if you were to examine, children's studies, or at least, children in the ancient world, or like any period in history, they're another lens to explore the wider context, which I think is underrepresented. And I think it's sort of like a final question to this amazing discussion. And Megan, in your opinion, do you feel that the science of, or I should say, let me word this, um, applying the same methodologies and the same scholarship of children's studies in the ancient Mediterranean world, could that be applied to other regions in history geographically, as well as different periods and eras? Let's say medieval Europe, medieval England, and even, of course, pre-Islamic Arabia, China, so forth.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, history in itself is by nature comparative, temporally, but it's also very useful to look at it like geographically, from a comparative approach as well. So, because it can tell you both, like, if you're only looking at one section of the world
Mm,
forever, and that's all you ever look at, it's all you know about, you miss things that someone else might notice because they're coming from a different world with a different set of understandings and conceptualizations. And it's so important to bring in these other perspectives. And that's one of the reasons I love seeing how much more indigenous archaeology perspectives are being brought into
mm.
all sorts of different archaeological approaches, especially in the Americas, because you're seeing things that you would not have noticed otherwise, because it's not something you would have picked out. And so if you're looking at, especially like medieval Europe, because medieval Europe is, especially in that early medieval, late antique period, they're very
Ah, yes.
organized. It's very like you're getting elements of distinctly medieval culture, but you're also still living with a lot of elements of ancient culture. That it's a very interesting blended situation happening there. So you can really learn a lot, I think, by examining these two different periods and these two different areas and saying, okay, how are the things we're seeing here looking sort of like the things we see here, or how do they look different? What can we learn by like bringing in what we know from this area? and applying it to this area. And that's actually when I did my senior seminar for archaeology a couple years ago. I brought in a lot of case studies from around different parts of the world. I was writing, it wasn't about children because it was a seminar based on food. So I was writing about the socioeconomic roles of priests in ancient Egypt during the Pharaonic period as expressed through their food ways in like religious contexts. And I was taking examples from studies done in Mycenae in Bronze Age Greece and examples from the Maya, the women in the Maya culture of Mesoamerica. And so you can learn a lot of things by doing this comparative approach. And I don't see why you shouldn't try that with children as well.
Absolutely, 100%. And just a little ending to this amazing discussion, I think when you look at, people say, you can see love through like the eyes of a children. It's almost the same thing when you can look at the ancient world. I mean, these children lived through, some of the most turbulent times. Most people think, oh, like the fall of the Roman Empire, but not only just that. If you look at just, of course, the Antioch plague, which decimated, the Mediterranean world heavily. You can look at, okay, well, who are the ones who are most at risk? I have one book, which is The Fate of Rome, which explores the disease and the plagues and all the other factors that led to the eventual collapse of the Roman state, not in the sense of like the idea of Rome itself, but like children were like, the heart of like the family. And going back to what you said of like, people have this misconception that people in the ancient world didn't care for their children. They did, maybe not to the, very loving expectations as we have in the modern world, but they did care for their children. I mean, they were their whole world. Literally, their children would be their gift to society to preserve the family name and to continue the line. And when those children go, I mean, that's a huge break, not just to the individual family, but to the large family as a whole. And I think we have to really give it the scholarship appreciation that it does, because it is very fascinating. And almost what you were saying, Megan, as how history is very comparative. We can sort of look at, okay, a child's life in a village, let's say the same region in Gaul. How has that life changed if we go into now the late antiquities period, the early medieval period, and see this growth, this influx of other cultures, where you have this mix of how, yes, there are some elements of Gaul mixing into this, but maybe they're taking some elements of Rome, this hybridization of what it is to be, not just a Germanic Roman Gaul or a Christian Gaul, but a child living in this world and how it impacts them from language they speak growing up to how they view the world, everything. It is very, very fascinating. It's one of the many reasons why I love doing this show. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing year 2024 with this final episode of season 2. I want to give a huge thank you to Megan for coming on the show, for telling us all about this amazing topic and the research she has done thus far and what she continues to do going forward into the new year. And also, huge congratulations for her in her academics. We wish her the best going forward. Now, Megan, where can people find and engage with you on social media if they want to reach out and learn more about the topics you've worked on? And do you have any publications that are out that people can view? And are there any other projects that you are going to be a part of in 2025?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is probably LinkedIn. It's just my name, Megan underscore Outtrim. And my publication, I only have one publication right now, but is listed on there. It's also on academia. It is the one about World War I children in France. And what's interesting about that one is it sort of talks a little bit about, how are the adults viewing it, but also how are children viewing themselves. So it's sort of going into that area that's even in this niche field, it's even more niche because it's really hard to see. It's how are children expressing their own agency? Do they see themselves the same way? And that's really difficult to see because they're not really producing things at the
Right.
same level. But you can find that on, again, academia or on my LinkedIn. And I don't have any big projects coming up for 2025. I can't do any digs this year because I'm buckling down to do my dissertation. But hopefully we're gonna ace that, and then gonna start looking at PhD programs. So
Awesome. I will link all that down below in the description of this video. Thank you everyone for joining me for another amazing episode here for the Historians Lounge, and also a huge thank you to all of you guys who have joined me now in what is now 2 amazing years, now going on 3 years of the Wandering Scribe YouTube channel, the Historians Lounge, author interviews, historians interviews, everything. It really means a lot to me, and I am so thankful, and I cannot wait to share with you all the plans I have going forward in 2025. And I don't want to give too much, so you just have to wait until January's newsletter comes out, which will be at the beginning of the new year. Well, until then, I will see you all in the next episode of the new year. And a huge thank you to Megan again for coming on the show, and we wish her the best going forward. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the final episode of this month, which will be tomorrow. And as always, I will see you all in the next episode. Have a wonderful day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world.